Hey everybody, my name is Chris Whitesides, and I'm coming at you from California State University Northridge Associate Students Outdoor Adventures. And I'm super happy to be joining you today for a 30-minute virtual tour of Grand Teton National Park. We're going to be using Google Earth as we jump around 13 different sites within the park, and we're going to cover a range of topics from geologic history to human history, and then some of the really cool animals that you might find in the park when you make it out there. With all that being said, I am not a geologist, biologist, not a scientist in any way, shape, or form. Definitely not a park ranger either. So please do treat this entire 30-minute tour as just that. If you're going on a virtual hover through the park with a friend, hardly a professional. Cool. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with our big old overview of the continental US. Just to situate ourselves, where we're going to be flying into the northern section of the Rocky Mountain Range, and as we start to hone in on the Grand Teton Range. So here we go. We got a little bit closer as we get to the border of Wyoming, where you're going to find the Yellowstone National Park and its sister park, Grand Teton National Park, just below it. We'll open up this bigger shot of the two parks and how they kind of fit and exist together. Yellowstone National Park is absolutely massive in comparison, comprising about 2.2 million acres compared to Grand Teton, this little tail down here, which is about 300,000 acres. So still big, but pales in comparison to big old Yellowstone and the first formal national park that was ever formed. With that being said, Tetons is super cool because it's got a stark contrast between the plains and open spaces before jutting up to these just colossal mountains that seem to rise out of nowhere. So let's keep on zooming in and go hunting for those mountains. We'll get a little bit closer, zooming in on the park itself, cutting out that Yellowstone portion, and you can see this big, massive mountain range, that Teton Range right here, followed by Big Jackson Lake and some of those open spaces that we just talked about. All these blue dots represent different sites throughout the park, so we're relatively condensed as we check out the park and then a little bit of the region in general. One more time, we'll do a map just of Grand Teton, and some of the roads that you can see going through there. There's 200 plus miles of trails throughout the park, definitely all in the range of mountains right here. But there's a lot of accessibility, a lot of development. It's a super easy park to do in that there's roads in the Rockefeller Memorial Highway, some different lodges and concessionaires throughout the valley. In human history, has played a big old role in the formation of all that development that we see today. But before we can even talk about human history, development, indigenous peoples, we got to figure out just how the heck these mountain ranges formed. I'm going to go ahead and optimize my Zoom so that I can share this video with y'all.
Billion years of geologic history into 1.5 minutes. It provides a glimpse of powerful geologic forces that have shaped this landscape. Notice today's view before the world spins back in time. As you journey back to the present, watch the changes unfold. The timeline and subtitles provide the narrative to this story. Today, the landscape seems unchanging, but erosion slowly wears down rocks and earthquakes may shatter the ground. Watch for signs of change in Grand Teton National Park.
All right, and we're back. That was a super duper quick tour of the history through, I think, 700 million years ago. And we saw all sorts of different elements at play creating this region. We saw earth and fire from magma activity and volcanic activity in the area. We saw those big old tectonic plates moving, shifting, pushing that earth and spreading it out. Eventually, we saw those tectonic plates rubbing against each other and either subducting or pushing up that mountain range. Then you go to the more recent, still a million years ago, history of glacial activity forming and carving out these mountain ranges that we see today and filling up and creating some of these lakes that we saw and leaving all that sediment too. That image where we saw the different silt and earth deposits that make up the entire region. So a super cool way of visualizing the geologic timeline that has created what we will see today. With that being said, let's take a look at what that actually looks like from Jackson Lodge, one of those nice little places you can stay if you want to make this a multi-day excursion and you're not quite ready for camping. But this is where we'll see those massive glacial fed lakes, those ranges jutting out at almost 13,000 feet above sea level, and these big wide open spaces. Really cool to see the end product and to know that Earth's forces are still shaping this area today and all areas in that aspect. With that being said, it looks super duper pristine, looks super beautiful, and we could see how it would be an attractive place for people to set up communities. Here at Jenny Lake, this is just one site where a bunch of different indigenous peoples called home. There were a whole bunch of different tribes of Native American peoples like the Shoshone, the Bannock, the Blackfoot, the Flathead, the Gros Nez, the Nez Perce, all of those names, which I probably butchered, and I apologize for doing so. But those people called this region home mainly during late spring, summer, and a little bit into fall, as they were pseudo-migratory. After those glaciers left all this water, they left a lush landscape and like a medicine cabinet and food pantry for people to hunt and gather. Let's take a little bit look at this artist's rendition of how those tribes settled on the banks of lakes like Jenny Lakes. So right here, this is a depiction of folks that would hunt for food. They'd hunt pronghorn and some of the other indigenous species in this area. And like we said, they'd gather or forage in the bushes for everything else that they needed. Here's another super grainy picture, but of a teepee that folks would call home and live and create those communities in. One good piece of evidence that we had settlements and had large developed communities in this area were underground fire pits, kind of like an underground barbecue, where folks would cook this camas root, which was a main staple of these indigenous people's diet. Let's keep going ahead and jump to our next location, which is going to be Jenny Lake, the exact same lake, but a little bit different view of the harsher winters. Like I said, indigenous peoples were relatively migratory in this region because of the harsh winters. Folks would follow the herds that they would hunt. As snow came and it was more difficult to forage, they would leave this more harsh landscape for greener pastures, if you will. After indigenous folks who had been here for, there's evidence of 11,000 years of human history, but eventually with westward expansion, tough word, westward expansion in the U.S., settlers started to arrive, coming west in covered wagons like this. Especially the Homestead Act, I believe of 1862, granting land privileges to folks that would come and settle and try and create homesteads. We saw a massive influx of settlers coming to this region to try and herd cattle and farm. This is another shot of it. And before those settlers even came, pre the Homestead Act, one of the first Anglo or persons of European descent that made his way out here was John Coulter. This is not a picture of John Coulter, but this is an image of what it may have looked like. John Coulter was a part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. super duper famous as they mapped the entire, they mapped their way out west all the way to the Pacific Ocean. At about this region, this kind of Rocky Mountain region, Coulter, who is really the technical expert of the group, a master hunter, a master barterer, translator, interpreter for the native folks, a master forager, a master route finder, was really the lifeblood of the early Lewis and Clark expedition and responsible for kind of the technical wayfinding of the trip. About in this Rocky Mountain region, just south, kind of near Jackson Hole, Coulter eventually split from the Lewis and Clark party to help some trappers and other mountain men. He was kind of prototypical mountain man trapper, but to help mountain men up in this region, and he stayed put right here. A kind of fun fact about that is John Coulter was paid a whopping $179.33 for 35 months of helping out Lewis and Clark. It's an incredible amount of money at the time to do incredibly strenuous work, but definitely responsible for the success of that expedition. Again, Coulter split from the group and came up here and really settled and started helping trappers, who were kind of the next people of European descent, to come in this area, trapping beaver and other animals for their fur, pelts, and meat. After Coulter came up and trappers were here, that Homestead Act was passed. Bringing more and more settlers out here. It was picturesque, it was beautiful, but the land was not super duper ideal for farming. It was a rocky soil that wasn't super duper fertile, and irrigation was relatively hard. And even cattle ranchers or ranching was difficult. Folks tries to raise cattle, and they tried to raise sheep in the area, but it didn't go very well. Life was hard for some of these early homesteaders. And because of that, homesteading was tough, really didn't take off in the area until the formation of dude ranches, which were ranches for dudes and dudenesses. I don't know how to pronounce it, but tourists from the East Coast who would get here by rail and wanted to experience that prototypical cowboy lifestyle. Dude ranches were set up where it was about $60 for a week of lodging, of horseback riding, of riding the ranges and following cattle and ranching, of exploring the mountains, of hunting, and anything else that kind of romanticized cowboy lifestyle entailed. Let's pan a little bit to the plains over here. And dude ranching and the popularity of it was responsible for kind of this area developing as a tourist attraction and less of a homesteading attraction. One caveat or one exception to that, one super successful group of homesteaders, which I think is important to point out, comes with the name Mormon Row. Mormon settlers in Utah made their way up to Idaho and eventually came out to this kind of northern Wyoming area. And instead of the relatively independent homesteads that got set up, where it was that just singular ranch with one family, Mormon Row was set up in communities, in groups, large families, all kind of working together to make it work. And Mormon Row did find relative success compared to some of the other homesteaders in these larger, more cohesive communities working together to survive the harsh plains lifestyle. So you've got some successful homesteaders, you've got booming dude ranches. All of a sudden, this region is developing quicker and quicker. More and more people are coming out thanks to railways, thanks to more disposable income in the area too. As the region continues to get developed, more people come out. John D. Rockefeller Jr., son of oil baron Rockefeller Sr., was a champion of protecting wild spaces. Under the guise of the Snake River Land Company, Rockefeller started buying up parcels of the entire region with the eventual goal of donating those lands to the national park system. He couldn't go buying them up under the Rockefeller name because that would look even fishier than making the kind of almost shell corporation of the Snake River Land Company, which was not universally loved. Ranchers in the area were questioning why this one company was buying up everything, a little bit skeptical that their way of life was under attack. But regardless of your political opinion on the Snake River Land Company, John D. Rockefeller did accumulate almost 30,000 acres and did eventually donate it to the national park system. It didn't get through on the first time for whatever reason. I didn't research this enough. But the federal government was relatively hesitant to accept this donation from Rockefeller. Yellowstone had already been formed. The political battles with the ranchers kind of led them to really hesitate in saying like, all right, yeah, we'll take it on. What's one more park? What's 30,000 more acres for us to manage? Eventually, Rockefeller said, look, you can accept this donation of land, or I can sell it, and who knows what the new owners will do. Maybe some nice oil derricks will look really good in the background of these mountains. The federal government eventually acquiesced and did accept the lands. Grand Tetons had a couple different forms before it got its name and its national park status, moving from kind of Jackson National Monument to different forms of a national monument, but eventually it was inducted into the national park system, thanks to philanthropic Mr. Rockefeller. Let's keep on rolling through and shift gears a little bit as we move from our human history over to some of the animals that called this place home and still do. One of which is not the Elk Ranch buffalo. That is a typo. I should have fixed that. Buffalo are indigenous or native to parts of Africa and parts of Asia, like a water buffalo. They got big old horns. They kind of look the same, except they're lacking the beard. The North American bison is the hipster cousin of the buffalo in that they have these big old shaggy beards, and that's probably the easiest way to tell them apart. Also, if you're in North America, you're not in a zoo, you're seeing a bison, not a buffalo. So don't look at that slide. So yeah, the North American bison call this range home. These animals can weigh up to 2,000 pounds. They're almost the size of a car. They live in these big old herds, and they're also responsible for the majority of animal, we'll call them incidences. As they're pretty territorial, they're bigger than everything out here, and folks like to get a little bit too close when they try and take a picture of the herds of these massive male buffalo or of the mama buffalo and their calves. So do give them some space, like this motorcyclist is doing. Do give them some space as you take pictures and find them out on the plains. Let's keep on moving from Elk Ranch. And even at Elk Ranch, you just spin right around, and you always have these gorgeous panoramic views of that Teton Range. Let's keep jumping from Elk Ranch Flats and the bison. Bison, not buffalo. Sorry about that. As we go to Schwabacher Landing. Schwabacher Landing is part of the Snake River, or a tributaries of it, and make for these really cool aquatic environments, which also include riparian areas. Riparian areas are kind of these areas directly adjacent to waterfronts where different plants, different animals call home, because there's a whole bunch of food, there's a whole bunch of nutrients, just really rich wildlife. One animal that you wouldn't think as a super duper aquatic animal is the moose, which is native to this area. Here's a moose, a female moose, and her calf. And they are hanging out right here at the waterfront because moose love to munch on aquatic plants that grow next to the water and even in the water. And moose are also super good swimmers. There are some stories and recounts of them swimming for up to miles and miles in waterways, in different lakes. So moose are very at home out in the water. And I never realized until I saw one in person just how massive this guy, a big old bull moose, is. I mean, there's your Subaru for comparison, but they are huge animals with even bigger horns, antlers up there, and they have this kind of cool, kind of goofy bell on the bottom of their chin right there. Moose are another animal to make sure you are very respectful of their space, as they too are territorial and, like the bison, bigger than anything else out here. We'll go to another spot on Schwabacher Landing to find another critter that might like to hang out in these aquatic areas, in these riparian areas. Lots of fish, lots of stuff to forage, but there are two types of bears that like to hang out over here. There's black bears, and then there's grizzly bears. Some difference, so you can know the difference between the two, are grizzly bears, like we see here, have a more prolific face profile with those eyes a little bit more indented. They also have kind of Pooh Bear ears, little circular ears going on, and probably the most telling sign, they've got this big hump on their back. Black bears will have a little bit more of an angular face, a little bit more straight lines going on instead of those indentations. They've got pointy ears, and then they've got that flatter back in comparison to the grizzly bears. But both call this area home and live pretty peacefully. These are another one that you're going to want to make sure you give a lot of space, especially if it's a mama grizzly and her cub, who right here, she's doing some coaching on how to climb a tree. We'll keep on moving from Swabacher and our black bears and grizzly bears. You know what? We're going to stay in Swabacher. You can tell I like this place. There's just too many beautiful shots. And it's also home to our beaver friends, the North American beaver, or the Latin name, my favorite Latin name, Castor canadensis. And these North American beavers, I had to read it like 4 times, but they can grow up to 70 pounds. They're little furry bowling balls for all intents and purposes. They've got these big incisor teeth, front teeth, not canines, not sharp ones. These big incisor teeth that help them chop down trees, just like a little lumberjack, and also eat the trees because their body can digest cellulose. But they chop down trees to build dams and control waterways. One of the only animals that really changes its environment for its benefit. These dams will stop moving water or create little pools of moving water where the chemical composition of the area behind changes, where the animal life, where the plant life changes in that stagnant water, all just to make the dam, to make lodges, which are the homes that they live in. Those lodges can be 8 feet wide by 3 feet tall. Something that you could super easy crawl in and hang out, but please don't, because they live in big old families. They live in colonies, just like Mormon Row. They all work together in different areas where their dams build lodges to make up colonies. So a super cool, super industrious animal, and also like little mini submarines. They've got built-in goggles and a translucent eyelid they can flip down when they're underwater. They've got almost waterproof fur because they don't migrate. They don't leave this place even when there's ice, even when there's snow. And they've got that that scaled, almost fish-like tail to help propel them through the water, or for them to slap the water and warn other beavers that people are in the area, or other predators in the area. A really cool animal that calls this region home. We'll keep on rolling from, we got bison, we got moose, we got a bunch of bears, we got beavers. What else we got going on for largest mammals in the area? I don't have any more largest mammals in the area for this slide, at least. This is just a picture as we go from Jenny Lake, from that Swabacher landing, and there's a bunch of hiking trails along the Teton crest, really that follow the water up, let you get some elevation and let you change biomes or environmental regions, like this one, where we're getting right above the tree line and we're getting into this alpine region, this craggy, almost more desolate region. But that's not to say that there aren't animals as we leave the water, as we leave some of that other foliage. A probably misplaced slide and picture is the pronghorn. The pronghorn lives mainly down on those plains where we came from, but it's kind of part of that larger deer family, which we're getting into right now, so we'll keep them right here. Pronghorns can run up to 54 miles an hour, and they live in these big old massive herds down on the plains. Animals that you are much more likely to see at elevation as we continue working our way up to 13,000 plus feet of Teton Peak is the mountain goat and the bighorn sheep. One of these animals is indigenous or native or occurs naturally in this area. Another one is an invasive species, a species that hasn't always lived here and was probably introduced by humans. I don't know if you can take a guess. They both look like, it seemed pretty natural to see both of these hanging out here, but the mountain goat is an invasive species introduced by people for hunting. Mountain goats exist in other regions of the Rocky Mountain range, but not specific to this Teton range. The only animal that's endemic, or an animal that's endemic to this area, is the bighorn sheep. They naturally call this region home. They graze along the mountains, and they were massive herds out here for the longest time. these herds of bighorn sheep started to run into trouble with humans first, not because of the mountain goats, but because of domesticated sheep herds that ranchers would run in this area. These bighorn sheep were susceptible to diseases that domesticated sheep brought with them, like scabies and pneumonia. Well, sheep pneumonia, not good. Being a relatively homogeneous body of animals, these bighorn sheep populations were decimated by pneumonia, that one sheep would catch it and it would spread like wildfire, and really put these animals in this region at risk. To compound that with the introduction of mountain goats, an invasive species, again, not endemic or not native, mountain goats started encroaching on those bighorn sheep territory as those herds wouldn't mix, and the mountain goats were a little less susceptible to some of those diseases introduced by people. An interesting trend that's going on right now, and a telling example of how we as humans really still don't have this whole park management thing down 100%, is there's a cull that's in effect. A cull, in essence, is the eradication of a typically invasive species in an area. So right now there's park management mandates out there that are killing off all of the bighorn sheep, again, just in this area, because they really don't belong here, and they're having a negative effect on the other animals in this area. As of today, what is it? It was June. I believe just last month, they're enlisting helicopters with hunters aboard those helicopters to shoot off and kill massive swaths of this mountain goat population, in hopes that our native bighorn sheep will have a little bit more of a foothold to come back from the brink of being eradicated or extinct from this area. So again, just one example that park managers are always trying their best to manage, protect, and preserve the healthiest form of these parks. But we're still a long way from figuring that out to perfection. Let's go ahead and jump to our last and final spot on this tour as we peek out from Grand Teton Range, again, 13,000 plus feet above sea level. We can just see this really cool panoramic shot of where glaciers would have carved out the remnants of those glaciers of snowmelt in these different pools. And we can swing around to see some of those hiking trails as we swing south. We would have taken some crazy alpine crest trail to hike all the way up here, like this gentleman did, who's prepared for all the elements. Really cool shot of a really cool park. So I wanted to thank you one more time for hanging out with me as we went through the geologic history, the human history, and then some really cool animals that call this place home. So thank you all for joining us and spending some time. We hope to see you for our live tours, which go down Mondays at 6 p.m. and then Thursdays at noon, where we explore other national parks throughout the U.S. And we're also starting to go international, checking out places like Japan, some of the wonders of the world, and rainforests of South America. So thanks very much. Have a good day, and I hope to see you in Grand Teton National Park someday.